some big breaking news to start tonight. A potential lifeline for two high-profile Americans stuck in Russia after months of pressure, with the Secretary of State now saying, guess what? There's a deal on the table to get Brittney Griner and Paul Whelan home. We've got new reaction from family members as Griner herself appears in a Russian court. Plus, we're talking money, yours, with the Fed hiking interest rates for the fourth time this year. Cars, credit cards, student loans, all of it may cost more. Why the Fed chair says this isn't the last of the hikes and his view on any potential recession. And a rare split between House Speaker Nancy Pelosi and the White House over her possible visit to Taiwan. And here's something we don't say too often. Pelosi has Republicans on her side. Why she's holding her ground ahead of the president's call with China's leader tomorrow. Plus, some survivors of 9/11 and the families of victims, they are pretty upset at former President Trump today because he's hosting a golf tournament from that new Saudi-backed league. We'll take you live to Bedminster with that. And for the first time, doctors say they've figured out a real link between head injuries in sports and CTE, a brain condition. Why the researchers say denying that is like denying smoking causes cancer. That's coming up a little later on in the show. Hey, I'm Hallie, and it is possible now tonight the WNBA superstar Brittney Griner could be coming home at some point relatively soon from Russia, along with Paul Whelan, an American who's also in prison there, because after months of pressure and questions on what the Biden administration is doing, we're learning there's a deal that's been offered to the Kremlin that would free both of these Americans. There are caveats, okay? There are caveats. We're going to get to those in a second, but here's what we know right now. Secretary of State Tony Blinken says he's asking to speak with his Russian counterpart, Sergei Lavrov, about this deal soon.
I plan to raise an issue that's a top priority for us. The release of Americans Paul Whelan and Brittney Griner, who've been wrongfully detained and must be allowed to come home. We put a substantial proposal on the table weeks ago to facilitate their release.
A substantial proposal, he calls it. So what does that mean, right? What are the specifics there? White House press aide John Kirby didn't get too specific, but he is telling reporters in just the last hour that, yeah, this is a serious proposal.
But I will say that the president and his team are willing to take extraordinary steps to bring our people home, as we've demonstrated with Trevor Reed. And that's what we're doing right here.
Okay, we talked about the caveats, right? It is possible that eventually this is some kind of a deal that could get Griner and Whelan home. It's also possible this all falls apart. We don't know yet. It's really early in the process. There are a lot of steps to go before this is a done deal, but it is still a big deal at the moment, and something the families of Whelan and Griner have been pushing for to open up this conversation. Remember, Whelan's been in Russia since 2018, and look at what his brother is saying now, out with a statement tonight, that he appreciates this Biden administration push, that he hopes the Russians take this deal, and that, in his words, no other American will be wrongfully held by their government in the future. Griner has been in Russia since February. She actually spoke today for the first time in her trial, as she's now pleaded guilty on drug charges, saying she was pretty much left in the dark by Russian officials after they found vape cartridges that had cannabis oil in her luggage. Here she was in court, and, watch this for a second. She's so tall, she can't actually stand up straight in that cell. She wasn't able to testify standing, so she sat. The judge let her sit down as she gave a play-by-play of what went down at the Moscow airport when she was detained. She says her rights were never read to her.
We had to use my phone and Google Translate for him to be able to tell me a little bit. I didn't know exactly what I was saying.
So she used this app to try to translate as this was happening. Keir Simmons is joining us now on all of these developments, and there are a lot. Okay, Keir, let's start with this substantial proposal, this deal that's on the table. There's somebody we've been talking about for months as a potential for a prisoner swap situation, the arms dealer Victor Boot. CNN is reporting that he's the guy in this deal, according to two sources. Kirby's not confirming. I actually spoke with Trevor Reed, as viewers of this show will know, 24 hours ago, who was pushing for this exact thing. I asked him specifically about whether this would be a swap worth making. Here's what he said.
We need to get them out as soon as we possibly can, and if that involves making an exchange, then we need to do that. Even if that exchange is for, let's say, Victor Boot? Even if it's for Victor Boot, it doesn't matter.
So give us the view as you see it, Keir, and you know the Kremlin so well, from how the Russians may look at this. We haven't had any reaction yet from them since Secretary Blinken came out in the last couple hours, right?
Well, that's right. I have no doubt in my mind, Hallie, that the Russians, the Kremlin, are interested in the idea of exchanging Victor Bout, possibly for Paul Whelan and Brittney Griner. In fact, when I interviewed Dmitry Peskov, the Kremlin spokesman, you'll remember a short time ago, I asked him whether Brittney Griner and Paul Whelan were hostages. He denied it and then immediately said in that interview, but you know who is a hostage? Victor Bout is a hostage. Of course, he is an arms dealer in prison for 25 years. So I think the Russians have certainly been making that connection, and they will be looking at what the Americans are proposing. They've never openly said that's what they want, though. And I think one of the stunning aspects of this is the fact that it's out in the open. Very unusual. You wouldn't normally see this happen. You'd normally learn about it as it's happening. That got me really surprised tonight.
Tell me what you think that signals, right? Because you make the important point that it's not like this public discussion of some kind of deal is the opening bid here. This apparently, these talks have been going on. This offer was made weeks ago. This is what Kirby was saying, that this has been weeks in the making. So as you read these tea leaves, why is it, do you think, that now there's this public push? Is it to close the deal or is it to get things moving?
Well, I think some of it may well be domestic. I think your interview yesterday, I suspect that, hurt a little bit. I think some of the criticism will have hurt the White House a little bit, and they will have felt like they need to get out in the front foot and show that they are acting, that they are making the most radical proposals. A prisoner swap is opposed in many parts of the American government for good reason, because the principle is that if you accept a prisoner swap, what you basically encourage the Russians and any other country to do is to just arrest another American so they can get another deal. So that's the principle there. This does have me a bit worried, Hallie, that they're putting this out in public. That they appear to be saying that they aren't getting a reaction from the Russians. The Russians think they play chess well. How will the Russians interpret this? Will they see this as a sign of weakness that the Americans have been open like this? Will they up their demands? We don't know what's happening behind closed doors. We know that Secretary Blinken is set to speak to Foreign Minister Lavrov. There's another interviewed Foreign Minister Lavrov. He is a wily character, a difficult character. He knows how to navigate his way around an untruth. And, I really think that what we're looking at here unusually is just pulling back the curtain on some very difficult negotiations. You really hope for the families that this is the opening salvo in what ends up being a deal that gets their loved ones home, right? But I think some caution is worth, it makes sense tonight, frankly. Yeah, the caveats, we got to talk about them. Keir, really quickly before I let you go, the timing here. It's coming on a day when Brittney Griner was already going to be in the headlines, for testifying, as you well know, on her own behalf in this Russian courtroom today. And the optics of that, I think, were really interesting here. I spoke with former Russian ambassador Michael McFaul, the former U.S. ambassador to Russia, who said he thinks that the conviction and the sentencing would have to happen for Griner before the Russians might move forward with any kind of deal. That might be right. The Russians do, and I think some of this is actually for their own domestic audience, for the message that President Putin wants to send to Russians, not to anyone else in the world. The Russians do like to put on a show of following the law, even though, by the way, as you mentioned, it came out today that Brittney Griner says that she wasn't read her rights, that she wasn't granted an attorney in those early stages. It was quite extraordinary to see her describe what really happened, and also to see her again in that cage. She asked in the courtroom, Hallie, to come outside of the cage because she couldn't stand up to give evidence. It's that small. The judge agreed that she could sit down to give evidence, but that gives you something of a picture of what she's going through.
Keir Simmons, live for us overseas tonight. Keir, thank you for that. I know we'll talk more on this down the road as this develops. So let's get to the story that would have been the one we started this whole broadcast with if we didn't get to that big news on Griner and Whelan, and that is the economy. That is your money. And I hate to tell you this when it feels like everything's expensive, but some things are going to get more expensive. They're about to. Your credit card loans, maybe. Your student loans, if they don't have a locked-in rate. Any new car, any new house loan might cost you a bit more, because for the fourth time this year, the Fed has raised interest rates. After going nearly 30 years without doing a rate hike of 0.75 points, the Fed's now done it in back-to-back months, okay? So now it's like 2.5 after being at 0, the rate for 2 years. And the Fed chair, Jay Powell, is saying this is probably not the end of it. But because inflation's been so surprisingly high, they have to be nimble. They have to be flexible. And he says, by the way, he does not think the U.S. is in a recession right now. We may get more of a signal on that tomorrow when some GDP numbers come out. What's the Fed's goal here, right? Why are they making some of these moves? They're trying to drive down borrowing for big ticket items like a house or a car. And we're already seeing some of that demand go down. Look at housing. Sales are down something like 8.5% from May to June. More than 20% since last June, all while costs are up 80% over the past 4 years. Cars are getting more expensive, too. It costs $11 more if you got a car loan in July compared to December. Okay, you're like $11. Fine. That's like 3 coffees, right? Over time, that adds up. More people than ever before are willing to make monthly payments of $1,000 or more, now nearly 13%. These costs squeezing the folks who sell the cars, as one Jersey City dealer told our Lindsay Reiser.
If you really need a vehicle, do your research. Make sure that you're buying from a very reputable place. If you can hold off for a little bit, I would try to hold off as much as you can.
CNBC's Kayla Tausche is joining us now. Kayla, I'm so glad to see you. Talk to us about the message from the Fed, right? Because it seems like they're ready to raise interest rates as high as they got to go to get inflation down.
Yeah, and the Fed has been eating a very healthy dose of humble pie after for a year saying that inflation was transitory. It was going to go away. And today we heard the Fed leaving the door wide open for any possibilities, noting that the economy, especially as the pandemic continues, is incredibly uncertain. Today, Chair Jerome Powell essentially said over the next 2 months, if inflation is still really high, really disappointing, then they'll be even more aggressive. But if the economy slows down and inflation gets under control, then perhaps they'll do less or stop these rate hikes. But he was very clear that he's not going to prescribe what the Fed will do until they have more data in hand. And of course, tomorrow's GDP data could be one more data point that they'll have to consider going forward.
It's all week. Kayla, I don't know when you're sleeping because it's like every day there's some new economic indicator that's out. I talked to the the deputy director of the National Economic Council, you know him, Bharat Ramamurthy, about some of these interest rate hikes just a couple of hours ago. I want to play for you something he told me. How confident is the NEC that this latest rate hike is going to actually finally slow down inflation?
Well, we respect the independence of the Fed, so I'm not going to comment directly on the Fed's decision. But what I will say is that Chair Powell and the Fed are very focused on bringing down inflation, and that's the president's #1 priority, too.
So there's not a ton the White House can do to fight inflation themselves, right? So is the White House, based on your reporting, going to ride this out at the mercy of the Fed?
Well, they're at the mercy of a few different institutions here, Hallie. I mean, they are on one hand at the mercy of the Fed, which as an institution has the benefit of never having to be on a ballot this year in 2024 or really ever. And today the Fed said essentially that a recession is preferable to continued inflation, saying essentially that in an economy, nothing works if prices aren't stable and that a slowdown might have to happen in order to get there. But the White House is also at the mercy of Congress. There are a lot of longer term fixes for the economy and inflation, like immigration reform, allowing companies to bring in legal workers from overseas to fill a lot of these jobs that would help these companies produce more and then meet the demand of consumers who are wanting to buy these things or travel to these places. But without certain solutions like that and having Congress on board, then the White House's hands are tied. But Hallie, just before we came on the air, there was some news that there is a deal that's been reached between Democratic leadership and Senator Joe Manchin, the West Virginia senator, who had been holding up a lot of these negotiations for policies that the White House and Democrats had hoped would at least lower certain costs like drug prices. And we're getting word that there is a deal now, and you will note that because Democrats are often chided for spending money to fix things like inflation, this bill, according to Manchin, is titled the Inflation Reduction Act of 2022. So that's what they are trying to argue this bill will do.
Kayla, you're displaying your competence not only as a financial reporter and White House reporter, but as an anchor, too, because you're teeing me up for exactly the question I was going to ask you. This news on Senator Manchin, it's a big deal. I mean, this is a big reversal for Manchin. He made headlines all over the place when he seemed to shut down this talk. Now he's sort of flipping the switch. Put it in layman's terms for us, right? Why this is so significant and why I have to imagine that as this news is trickling out, literally as we speak, as we've been on the air, I have to think that a lot of Democrats across the street at the Capitol are starting to celebrate here.
What we don't know, Hallie, is what the White House and what other members of the party had to cede in order to get Manchin on board, because he had been a stalwart in these negotiations and had said that he believed that any money that they would spend would make inflation worse. He wanted to get more data. So what we don't know is what the White House had to give up in order to get this. Did they give him a green light on a natural gas pipeline called the Mountain Valley that runs across West Virginia? That had been something that had been discussed behind the scenes. What actually did they have to promise to get this across the finish line? That's what we're going to be reporting in the hours to come.
Kayla, Tausche, would love to have you back. Always good to see you. Thanks, friend. Glad to be on. President Biden coming back to the Oval Office today with his aviators on. Check it out. A little bit of pep in his step as he was hopping up to the microphone there. A sign he's feeling better, as he says. There he is, just a few days after getting COVID last week. He tested positive. He's speaking now from personal experience with the virus, giving a direct message to Americans. Watch.
COVID was killing thousands of Americans a day when I got here. That isn't the case anymore. You can live without fear by doing what I did. Get boosted, get tested, and get treatment.
President Biden's chief medical advisor, Dr. Anthony Fauci, echoing the president, saying a big wave of COVID infections is projected to hit the U.S. this fall. And he says the country's best guess at a solution, a BA.5 specific booster shot. I want to bring in Mike Memoli. All right, Mem, I felt like President Biden in some ways was doing a bit of a COVID victory lap, but in some ways really trying to be messaging here something critical, which was this idea that you don't have to be the president to get the kind of care that a president would get, that his administration is really trying to and has been trying to amp up the pandemic response to be able to offer things like testing, treatments, et cetera.
You know, Hallie, I'm not aware of any CDC guidance as it relates to aviators after you're dealing with COVID-19, but the president was clearly going for a look there. He had the mask on. He took that off when he got to the podium, kept the aviators on. And this was really a triumphant moment for the White House at a really important moment. You had staff gathered in the Rose Garden applauding the president upon his return. We've seen a number of photos and videos of him back to work since then. But really, this was, as Ron Klain put it in the early days of the president's COVID diagnosis, a teachable moment. The president really wanting to make the point, as White House officials have been making to me privately, that, you know, yes, we need to keep our guard up in the face of BA.5, a very highly transmissible variant. But COVID is no longer necessarily something that need disrupt our lives. If you are vaccinated, if you are boosted, if you have the treatments that are available to you, you can do what the president did. You can work from home and largely see what essentially was a mild cold. Now, obviously, the White House is going to be closely monitoring the president in the days ahead. They say the chances of a relapse are very small based on the data, but that this is something that the American people should look at in a very tangible form now as really matching up the guidance that they've been giving in a more abstract sense leading up to it.
Yeah, and I think that you bring up, and you have brought up something interesting, too, which is this idea of transparency from the White House. What I thought was interesting, too, as we were on the air as President Biden was delivering the speech from the Rose Garden, is the way he drew a contrast with former President Trump. Different time, Mem, obviously, like there were no vaccines that were available at the time that Donald Trump got COVID, et cetera. But also, I wonder how much the White House has also been drawing a contrast behind the scenes on the transparency factor. It only was in, I think, Mark Meadows' memoir that we found out just how sick Donald Trump really was at the time.
That's right. Yeah, there were certainly some questions about the Biden administration as it relates to transparency in the last few days, including the fact that they were not putting Dr. Kevin O'Connor, the president's chief physician, at the podium to talk about his condition on a daily basis. The White House really bristled at those comparisons, noting that the former president, while in office, in fact, while at a debate against the current president, may have very well had COVID-19 and could have transmitted it to his rival at the time. And so you heard the president himself do something which he hasn't done a lot as president, only in key moments, but he's doing a lot more lately, which is draw an explicit comparison to the fact that his predecessor, unvaccinated, suffered serious illness, had to be, as he put it, airlifted to Walter Reed. And as Biden put it himself, he was able to work above the store, keep the business of the nation at hand, at the forefront, even as he battled some mild symptoms here.
Mike Memoli live at his post on the North Lawn. Mike, good to see you. Appreciate it, Mem. To the Capitol attack now, down Pennsylvania Avenue, where we're getting some new hints that the investigation by the Justice Department goes beyond the rioters themselves. After an administration official is telling NBC News that the DOJ is asking questions about former President Trump's actions related to January 6th as part of their broader investigation. We don't know specifics on what those questions are, right? But 4 people familiar with the matter tell the Washington Post that they include some very detailed requests for information about meetings Mr. Trump had back in December 2020, after the election, in January 2021, the so-called fake electors scheme, the pressure campaign on former Vice President Mike Pence. DOJ not officially commenting. We've reached out to a spokesperson for the former president, too. We'll let you know what he says when we hear back. I want to get to NBC's Justice correspondent Pete Williams here. And Pete, important nuance, important language selection here, which is, based on your reporting, you're told we've got to be careful to draw the distinction. This does not mean there is a criminal investigation opened into Mr. Trump. It's really about finding out everything that happened for the DOJ.
Yes, that's the impression I get from the people I've talked to. As you rightly point out, this reporting originally from the Washington Post. But what I'm told today is that this is at the stage of, we want to know what happened here. They are very eager to know what people were telling the president, what he was telling them about the pressure to put on Pence, and also this effort to count these slates of electors from states that Joe Biden won. But the idea was send them in anyway, maybe get them to the floor of the Senate, maybe have Pence either count them or discount all the ballots from those battleground states, which obviously the vice president decided he didn't want to do. So it's at that stage. It's not at the stage of opening an investigation into Trump specifically. That's the idea. They're still at the what happened here stage.
So as we're getting some drip, drip, drip from, this piece of the investigation the Department of Justice is conducting, there's also the January 6th investigation as well. It becomes clear that there are some things maybe the DOJ knows, maybe the January 6th committee knows. Some of it is being conducted in public and some of it is not,
Well, absolutely right. I mean, we don't know most of what the Justice Department is doing, and only when we get these little glimpses. So we're sort of looking through a piece of Swiss cheese at their investigation. But I thought the Attorney General had a good point yesterday. He said, yeah, there are things that the January 6th committee has done that we haven't yet, and things that we've done that they haven't done yet. And they're parallel investigations. They're not in locksteps. They have sort of different organic structures to them. So you wouldn't expect them to march down the evidence in the same order, and that's to be expected.
You mentioned the interview that Lester Holt did with Attorney General Merrick Garland exclusively for NBC News. He told Lester this is going to be the most wide-ranging investigation, he thinks, in the history of the Department of Justice. This is new territory for the DOJ, especially as it relates to the investigation of a former president, potentially a presidential candidate, right, if Donald Trump decides to run. Can you talk about some of the challenges the DOJ is navigating with these sensitive political pressures?
Well, not to mention the fact that there are going to be something like 900 criminal investigations related to the Capitol riot. So that's all part of this enormous task that the Justice Department faces. But I think the task is this. If they ever get to the stage of deciding whether, for example, to file charges against Donald Trump, then I think they have to ask themselves this question. There is a principle of federal prosecution that says it's not enough just to say, you know what, let's roll the dice and see if the jury buys it. The principle of federal prosecution is you don't bring a case unless you have a strong belief that you can get a conviction. And the fact may be that when you're charging a former president, there's an even higher standard. They have to be supremely confident in your case, and not only that you can succeed legally, but that you can also make the case publicly and explain why you're doing this. Now, I don't think they're anywhere near making that decision, but at some point they may have to face it, and I would think that's something they'll have to think about.
Pete Williams, good to see you. Thank you for that breakdown.
You too. Okay.
Today on Capitol Hill, House Speaker Nancy Pelosi seems to be holding her ground in a rare split with the Biden administration over an issue that Republicans are actually siding with her on. The drama all over this potential visit to Taiwan. And today you've got Democrats and Republicans rallying behind Speaker Pelosi, encouraging her to go through with the trip, even as President Biden is discouraging her from it, saying that U.S. military officials think it is, quote, in his words, not a good idea right now. The tensions between the self-ruled island and China escalating. Pelosi would be the highest-ranking lawmaker to visit Taiwan in 25 years, according to the AP. And China is not happy about it, threatening what they describe as forceful measures if the trip goes forward. That's a threat that'll probably come up tomorrow when President Biden and Chinese President Xi Jinping are set to talk. I want to bring in now Scott Wong. And Scott, we know that Speaker Pelosi has invited some top lawmakers to join. Tell us more about all this.
Hallie, earlier today I caught up with Mike McCall. He is the ranking Republican on the Foreign Affairs Committee. He said that he had been personally invited by Pelosi on this CODEL, this official government trip to Taiwan earlier this summer. He has declined that invitation, citing personal obligations, but this was the first on-the-record confirmation that a trip to Taiwan is in the works. We've talked to a number of other sources who have been talking about the trip on background, but this was the first on-the-record confirmation. Now, the Speaker's office is not confirming the trip. They say they can neither confirm nor deny that she's going to do any international travel, citing security protocols. But it's not just McCall. I caught up just a few moments ago with Anna Eshoo. She is a Democrat like Pelosi from the San Francisco Bay Area, very close to the Speaker. She said she also got an invitation to travel with the Speaker to Taiwan. And so there are a lot of conversations happening in the Capitol. A lot of bipartisan support, as you mentioned, for the Speaker to show solidarity with Taiwan and travel to that democratic island. Obviously, this is creating quite a kerfuffle with the Biden administration. The president himself earlier this weekend talked a little bit about how he had heard concern from military officials who were concerned that a potential Pelosi visit to Taiwan could create some kind of international crisis. So very interesting developments to be watching on Capitol Hill as this goes forward.
Pelosi weighing the benefit, in her view, of going and traveling and showing support for Taiwan versus, of course, the kind of headache that the White House has suggested that would create for them. Scott Wong, thank you so much. Good to see you. George Floyd's family tonight says they're feeling disappointed about the sentencing of 2 ex-cops who played a role in Floyd's death. J. Alexander Kueng was sentenced to 3 years and Tu Tao to 3.5 years for their roles in Floyd's 2020 death. That's less than the recommended sentencing range, which is 4 to 5 years. Kueng, who held down Floyd's torso, and Tao, who kept a group of bystanders back, were convicted in February of failing to stop Derek Chauvin, also an ex-officer, from kneeling on Floyd's neck. Today's hearing was federal court, so no cameras allowed inside, but our team who was there told us that Tao delivered a rambling 22-minute-long speech in which he apologized to the court. Not to the family, though. He also quoted several scriptures from the Bible. Floyd's partner spoke out about that this afternoon.
Only when you repent that you find forgiveness. And he has not made any attempt to feel anything that we're feeling, to reach out, even in the courtroom, to say something to the family.
I want to bring in now NBC's Shaq Brewster, who is following this one. Shaq, bring us up to speed on how this unfolded and what's next.
Well, the judge really explained his decision to go under the recommended sentencing guidelines and what prosecutors were asking for by first saying that this was a serious offense that resulted in the death of George Floyd. He said that both of these former officers should have known that under their custody should be under their care, and they didn't take that seriously enough. But you also heard this judge express real sympathy toward these 2 defendants who will now be in federal prison for more than 3 years. He said that for Alexander Kueng, he was a rookie officer sent in a tough area, his words, of Minneapolis. He said that he was simply following what Derek Chauvin was doing. For Tu Tao, that was the officer who we know was interacting with the bystanders when you watch that video that really started and sparked that social justice movement. He said that while Tu Tao had lots of experience, a lot more experience than the other defendants, he was someone who had a kind and calm demeanor, and said that he was dealing with what he called active bystanders and sometimes a hostile crowd, and had a lot of other factors involved in there. So he mentioned letters that he got from other officers. He mentioned petitions from other folks calling for a lighter sentence. And it seems as if that went into his decision making when bringing down and handing down that ultimate sentence of about 3 years for those 2 former officers. But you mentioned the family for George Floyd. They were not happy at all. You heard from Courtney Ross there, who you just played a little bit of sound from. She actually testified in the courtroom. She asked for the judge to have a higher sentence, mentioned that she was disappointed with the sentences of some of the other former officers involved in this situation, and she did not get that heavy sentence that she asked for.
Shaq Brewster, thank you for that update. Appreciate it. Coming up, officials in one city in Japan worried about a gang of monkeys terrorizing people there. At least one person attacked in their sleep. We'll tell you more about that. Plus, later, a family suing a funeral home for $50 million over an alleged body mix-up. What they say happened when their loved one's casket was lowered into the ground. Stay with us. We're back with a breaking news update. Just a quick one on the cases of Brittney Griner and Paul Whelan, following up what we told you about at the top of the show. This deal the U.S. has put on the table to get them home. We are just learning now from Russia's news agency that Russia says it hasn't gotten any requests from the U.S. government to talk about releasing detained Americans. The Secretary of State had said today that he was going to reach out, hope in the coming days, to speak with his counterpart there in Russia. We're also hearing from Griner's Russian defense team, which says it's not participating in any swap discussion, and that a swap would only be possible after there's a verdict in her case. Wanted to bring you up to speed on that. We also want to stay with international news that's hitting here at home with this Saudi-backed golf tournament, Live Golf, announcing they're expanding big time to 14 tournaments next year with more than $400 million available in the prize money pool. That's more than $150 million more than this year. The controversial league saying they're ready to expand their global footprint across North America, Latin America, Asia, Australia, the Middle East, and Europe. But it is not without a spotlight, and not all of it good. Some 9/11 survivors and family members are now ramping up the criticism on the league and on former President Trump for agreeing to host this tournament at Bedminster, his New Jersey golf club. The family's even put out a new ad against this whole thing. Watch.
This golf tournament is taking place 50 miles from ground zero.
It's disgusting.
Worse than a slap in the face.
You're taking money from an evil regime.
15 Saudi citizens were involved in 9/11, and the country is accused of other human rights violations, with the U.S. saying they were responsible for the murder of Washington Post journalist Jamal Khashoggi. Thing is, Saudi Arabia has a ton of money, and some experts suggest they're using it for so-called sports washing. This idea of trying to clean up the image of Saudi Arabia through sports. They've already brought in some of golf's biggest name to this tournament. Phil Mickelson reportedly got $200 million just to participate, just to play. I want to bring in now Jaime Diaz from NBC Sports, who was posted up at Bedminster. And Jaime, it's good to see you. I know that more than 100 people impacted in some way by 9/11 are going to go protest this Live tournament at Bedminster. Talk about the significance of all this.
Well, the protesters represent a large segment of the population that really objects to Saudi Arabia spending billions of dollars to put on big-time sports presentations for the purpose of obscuring their reputation for human rights violations. And also they're criticizing former President Trump for insensitivity, first of all, holding this event in New Jersey where 750 people died in 9/11 and so close to New York City. Also sort of for, deflecting questions about the protest and saying, I don't know much, telling the Wall Street Journal, I don't know much about the 9/11 families. He also said that the Khashoggi sort of controversy has died down. So, again, he's getting hit for looking like he's not really paying attention to this protest.
The PGA of America officially ended its own agreement with former President Trump after what we saw at the Capitol on January 6th, the insurrection there. And I wonder, it's interesting, Jaime, we wouldn't usually have you on a news show, right? We would watch you on the Golf Channel. You'd be doing your thing there on the analyst side. But this is sort of crossing over into the world of politics, of international relations, and of, Donald Trump and the sort of web of controversies that surround him.
Yeah, Donald Trump would love to get back into golf. He loves golf. He plays golf all the time. He would love especially to hold a men's major at one of his courses. And he was in line to do that at Bedminster right here in 2022 for the PGA Championship. But then the insurrection happened in January 6th, and the PGA of America decided, no, we can't go there. They went to Southern Hills in Tulsa instead in just this last May. And, the former president's also upset. He bought Trump Turnberry in Scotland, a great course that's held the Open Championship many times. But since he's bought it, the R&A, the Royal and Ancient sort of rulers of golf over there for the Open Championship have said, no, we're not going to ever hold it when Donald Trump is the owner. So he's been shut out in that way, and I think it gives him extra motivation, to get back into golf.
This Live tournament, it's still on for Friday, Jaime. As you know, it's going to go down there in Bedminster. I wonder what that says and what else you can tell us about the idea of Saudi sports washing, quote unquote, in this push to try to fix their public image.
Well, yeah, it kind of says that, they made a calculation, and perhaps for the moment, that investment has been worth it in terms of forestalling, people stopping Saudi in terms of their reputation. They're back into sports right now. The defense is that one defense about that is that Saudi is so entangled in our economy with so much money that is from Saudi Arabia. Greg Norman, who's the CEO of Live Golf, says that 23 of the sponsors of the PGA Tour have spent more than $40 million on Saudi business. So this is something that, is really looks like hypocrisy to some people who are saying they're singling out the golf too much. Also, fans are saying that the the players here are just saying, hey, we're just professional athletes. We're not, we're not politicians, and that's good enough for some sports fans. So far they've kind of dodged at least the protest enough that the tournament's certainly going to go on.
Jaime Diaz, NBC Sports golf analyst. Really glad to have you on breaking that down. Thank you for being with us. Let's get you over to the 5 things our team thinks you should know about tonight. Number 1, today, hundreds of protesters stormed Iraq's parliament in Baghdad, many of them followers of an influential cleric, demonstrating against a nominee for prime minister by Iran-backed parties. No lawmakers were there. Number 2, officials in a Japanese city say they are getting really nervous that a bunch of monkeys suspected of attacking people are still on the loose. Officials say they put one of these monkeys down, but they're keeping an eye out for others. Look, more than 50 people have been hurt. Scratches, light bites, although you have to think no bite is light when it's from a monkey. There's apparently been break-ins. One guy got attacked in his sleep. Number 3, we've told you before about places planning on naming heat waves. It is happening now. This week, Zoe hit Sevilla, Spain. Temperatures got past 110 degrees, which reportedly put it in the most severe tier of the city's new heat wave ranking system. Heat wave Zoe over there. Number 4, a new study just out from the New England Journal of Medicine found vitamin D supplements. A lot of people take them to make their bones healthier. They don't actually lower the fracture risk. They don't actually lower the risk if you're a healthy American adult. Something to know. Number 5, a huge pink diamond, like 170 carats huge. Look at this. It was discovered in Angola. It's called the Lulo Rose, named after the mine it was found in. The company that owns the mine says it is the biggest pink diamond found in something like 300 years. I want to take you back to Capitol Hill now with that breaking news we touched on at the top of the show. A breakthrough, frankly, for Democrats. Now that West Virginia Senator Joe Manchin is announcing details of a deal with Majority Leader Chuck Schumer on basically an energy bill, a health care bill. We are just starting to find out some of the fine print here. This thing could be worth more than $1 trillion. The bill includes $400 billion through tax reforms, money for prescription drug pricing reform, $290 billion, tons of money for energy security and climate change, and $300 billion to shore up the deficit. Those are the numbers, Hallie Vitale, our Capitol Hill correspondent, who has leaped in front of a camera for us. And let me ask you to do something, Al, because you know the vibe of the show is like, just give it to us straight. Take off your, political, all day in the weeds hat. Give us the big picture here, because Manchin flipped, then flopped, then flipped again. But the bottom line is this is probably good news for Democrats who want to see a big energy and climate bill ahead of the midterms. Is that fair?
Yeah, but at the same time, they wanted to see a big energy and climate bill before the midterms back in December when they were doing the roughly $2.5 trillion version of this. And so there's things in it that they like. I think most Democrats at this point, when we all got this alert on our phone, I'm going to be honest, we were surprised about this deal coming together. Manchin is out with COVID. These talks seem to have broken down at one point. Now it's clear that they were quietly huddling, even despite Manchin's COVID diagnosis, trying to hash out the finer details of this. And frankly, as I've been getting senators in the hallway, many of them are sort of playing catch up on this too. You know, sometimes these lawmakers play dumb a little bit. They say, oh, I don't know what's in it. No, really, in this case, a lot of senators didn't actually know what was in this bill. I had staffers saying to me, hey, you seen anything on this? And so this was very much something that was dropped in the laps of Democrats up here on the Hill I also have to say the fact that this came after they passed chips in the Senate is notable timing here, because the first thing that we asked ourselves is, was this some kind of bait and switch on the part of Schumer and Manchin trying to get Republicans to think that they weren't going to have anything on reconciliation? It's sort of a line that McConnell had drawn for his caucus in terms of if they would be able to go forward with chips if they were going forward with reconciliation. So there's a little bit of politicking here between the parties, too, that we're digging into.
Chips, of course, that bill on semiconductors and the creation of those. Microchips. Hallie Vitale, love it. Thank you. Thanks for sprinting. Appreciate it. Still to come, lawmakers, speaking of them, putting pressure on President Biden to help another American who is in prison overseas. Why a Navy lieutenant has been sentenced to 3 years in a Japanese prison. Reporting there this week. Next. Just before we came on the air, the National Security Council saying the safety and well-being of its service members is a priority as the family of a naval officer in prison in Japan calls on President Biden and the U.S. ambassador to Japan to negotiate his release. Navy Lieutenant Ridge Alconis' family telling us in a statement, this week has been incredibly hard as we watched Ridge be taken away from us for the next 3 years, all for a tragic accident beyond our control. If you don't know Alconis' story, we're going to fill you in here. He's at the Tokyo detention house now for processing before being sent to prison. And last October, he was convicted of negligent driving and sentenced to 3 years behind bars. Alconis and his family, you saw their picture there, they were in the car driving home from a hike on Mount Fuji back in May 2021. He says a case of altitude sickness caused him to lose consciousness behind the wheel. He ended up slamming into people, killing an elderly woman and her son-in-law. Alconis filed an appeal, but earlier this month, Tokyo's high court rejected that. This has caught the attention of lawmakers, including Senator Mike Lee, who just this week said Alconis' sentencing is too high of a price to pay. Watch.
To have him sent to prison for 3 years, bereft of his friends, his family, his career that he so deeply loved, his children, to whom he is everything. This is wrong, Madam President.
I want to bring in now Matt Bradley, who is following this story for us. And Matt, it's a little bit under the radar, I think, the story of Ridge Alconis, but not for some lawmakers who say the trial process wasn't fair, that this whole thing broke an agreement between the U.S. and Japan. Help us understand the context.
Yeah, I mean, the context for this goes all the way back to World War II. That was when the U.S., of course, was occupying Japan after the end of the Second World War. And then it goes back to the Status of Forces agreements from 1960, that year when the U.S. and Japan decided on the terms for the U.S. troop presence that was going to be remaining in Japan, still remains there. One of the largest U.S. troop presences in the world outside of Germany. You know, Okinawa is the main center of all of this. And there's been multiple issues ever since the 1960s involving U.S. troops and their behavior in Japan towards the Japanese public. And, you know, this has become the kind of issue that rises and falls with Japanese jingoism and with, you know, concerns about Japanese nationalism. We saw Shinzo Abe, who was just assassinated. He was one of the champions of Japanese nationalism in modern times. You know, these things come and go in Japan. But the fact of the matter is that the context around this, around the Alconis tragedy here, it really is about whether or not the Japanese people feel as though the Status of Forces agreement leans too far in favor of the American forces who are there. So this is a big issue. Whether or not the U.S. forces, and there are hundreds of thousands of them, are, you know, enjoying some sort of privilege that Japanese citizens themselves don't. And some of the issues that go along with that are Americans who, when they're accused of crimes, they're then able to, you know, enjoy some sort of diplomatic protection that allows them to leave the country before they're interrogated by Japanese police. All of these things go back decades. Remember, in 1995, there was a rape incident involving 3 U.S. troops and a young Japanese girl in Okinawa. Those sorts of memories persist in Japan. And that's why there's so much anger around incidents like this.
I spoke with Trevor Reed, who is, of course, the Marine veteran who was detained in Russia for several years. And Alconis' story, right, the case of Ridge Alconis is one that he really wanted to call attention to, raise awareness of. Alconis' wife has been out. She is pushing for, you know, some sort of justice in this case. What would need to happen next if, in fact, you know, Alconis' wife gets what she ultimately wants and gets her husband home?
Yeah, I mean, I've been paying attention to your conversations with Trevor Reed. He acts as though, and far be it for me to, undermine what he's saying, but, he acts as though this is something where U.S. officials can just snap their fingers and free prisoners who are held abroad. Well, that's really not necessarily the case. I mean, especially in Russia, in a place where the United States doesn't have a status of forces agreement. The situation in Japan is totally different from the one in Russia, which is what Trevor Reed would be referring to. When you're talking about someone like Altones, I mean, you're talking about someone who is protected and also not protected under a status of forces agreement that has lasted for decades. So it's kind of hard to really overlay these different national experiences on U.S. troops and U.S. citizens who are all over the world.
Matt Bradley, thank you. Coming up here on the show, how much money do you think gun makers have made from selling assault-style weapons in the past decade? Congress says it has a number. We'll tell you coming up. Plus, a plane crashing near a crowded Seattle beach. Look at this. We'll tell you how people were able to get the pilot to safety. We'll be right back. NBC News covers hundreds of stories every day, and because you couldn't possibly read or watch or listen to them all, our bureau teams have done it for you. This is what they tell us is going down in their regions in a segment we call The Local. From our Northeast Bureau, a New Jersey family is suing a funeral home for $50 million. They say they almost buried the wrong person because of an alleged mix-up. The family says after their mother's casket was lowered into the ground, the funeral director admitted there was a mistake, that they had the wrong person. The lawsuit claims the funeral home failed to follow its policies to make sure bodies are properly identified. The funeral home did not immediately respond to NBC News' request for comment. Also, from our Northeast Bureau, some pretty wild pictures out of Pennsylvania. Check out this parking lot near Pittsburgh. It just collapsed. Dozen cars ended up in like this big hole. You had people displaced from their apartments. It kind of looks like the parking lot just broke, right near that building. They're still trying to figure out why the ground collapsed in the first place. From our West Coast Bureau, a small plane made an emergency landing on the water in the Sound right near Seattle, just yards away from a crowded beach. You see the plane hit the water there. It flipped after that. It started to sink, but people nearby rushed in. They tried to get the pilot out. They did. He was taken to the hospital, and luckily no serious injuries have been reported. The FAA is investigating. Here in D.C., you've got the House Oversight Committee wrapping up a hearing where they grilled CEOs of two big gun manufacturers whose assault rifles were used in recent mass shootings. Listen to this.
Congresswoman, with all due respect, while as I grieve like all Americans at these tragic incidences, again, to blame the firearm, the particular firearm in use here that we're talking about, modern sporting rifles.
Thank you.
To blame the firearm as an inanimate object.
The hearing started with a message from survivors and family members of the victims of some of the worst mass shootings in the country, including Uvalde, Highland Park, Sandy Hook. Earlier, the committee released new data showing big gun companies made more than $1 billion by selling military-style assault weapons over the last decade. One company's sales tripled, Congress says, from 2019 to 2021. As gun deaths in the U.S. keep going up. Hallie Raffa joins us now. And Hallie, Congresswoman Maloney, who chairs this committee, said that they were also subpoenaing, trying to use some legal muscle to get the CEO of Smith & Wesson in. Didn't show up today. Talk about what lawmakers want to get out of this hearing, out of that subpoena, and some of the emotional testimony that we heard today, too.
Yeah, Hallie, well, I think it's important, first off, to note how much of the day that this hearing took up. This hearing lasted for hours. It ran almost 2 hours over schedule as Democrats on this committee really aimed their frustrations at the heads of these gun companies, saying that they bear the responsibility for the influx in gun violence and the recent mass shootings in this country. And at some points of this hearing, debate got pretty heated as Republicans on this committee and the heads of these companies argued their case, saying that this is, a sentiment that we've heard from Republicans before, that this is a mental health issue, that this is about preventing guns from getting into the hands of the wrong people, rather than putting the blame on these gun companies. But Democrats on this committee are saying, regardless, the fact that Congress was able to come to some sort of bipartisan, historic gun legislation, that there is enough need to go around, that the gun manufacturing companies can also play their part too. And they laid out some arguments as as to what could be improved upon. They said that these companies don't track deaths or injuries caused by these weapons. They don't monitor any of the adjustments made to these firearms to track whether they're going to be able to use bump stocks or any sort of regulations to be able to make these guns stronger. And one eye-opening moment of this hearing was when the committee members talked about some marketing practices that these gun companies use to really make their weapons more accessible and enticing for a consumer, a young consumer. They said that they appeal to buyers' masculinity. They showed an example of an ad that showed an argument for purchasing an AR-15, saying that it, quote, legitimizes your status at the top of the testosterone food chain, saying that is now irrevocable. They showed that selling guns, they showed another marketing tactic that really helps these gun manufacturing companies sell guns to mass shooters on credit, saying it's more of like a buy now, pay later system. They showed evidence of celebrities, military imagery, even video games being used to sell these guns to a lower people of lower ages, more younger people. And so Chairwoman Maloney of this committee is saying that this is all in an effort to make change, right? She's saying that at the end of all of this, she's hoping to propose some more legislation that could possibly change how gun manufacturers run their marketing practices and run their companies at the end of the day, Hallie.
Ali Rafa on the Hill for us tonight. Thank you. Also tonight, people all around the world are making a lot of noise about a new CTE brain disorder study. Why? Because for the first time ever, researchers from Harvard and 8 other schools found evidence that the progressive brain disease can be linked to repeated blows to the head. You know that CTE can lead to big changes in mood, behavior, the way the brain works. There's no cure for it. It can only be diagnosed after death. Former NFL players Demaryius Thomas and Vincent Jackson are some notable names recently diagnosed with it. Evidence of CTE has been found in athletes participating in a bunch of different sports: boxing, hockey, soccer, and more. And several leagues like the NFL, the NHL, and the NCAA have previously denied the link between hits to the head and CTE. I want to bring in Dr. Natalie Azar. And Dr. Azar, first, can you break down what this study says? Because the research suggested that letting kids play contact sports is kind of similar to like saying there's no link between smoking and cancer.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and actually that's kind of like one of the big takeaways is that the experts are saying, based on these study findings, that, you know, policymakers and pediatricians, parents, that we need to be thinking about repeated impacts in our children the same way we do think about exposure to smoking and to lead and things like that. So it could have like significant public health implications. And I think, you know, sort of the big picture here is that, you know, as you pointed out in the lead, CTE has been associated with repeated head impacts, but there's never been truly a causal link established. And so what this study did was actually applied a very important statistical tool, these criteria, things like they looked at specificity, consistency, temporal relationship, plausibility. They applied 9 different things to try to really look at the relationship to see whether or not they could in fact deduce causation, and they say that they can. So this is significant, right, Hallie? Because think about especially children, you know, young athletes, they're not giving informed consent to be playing these games that could potentially lead to this trauma down the line. So I think if people are paying attention, we could very well see some significant policy changes in terms of how the games are played and, you know, to eliminate or significantly reduce this RHI, this repeated head impact.
To that point, The Athletic says UK Soccer League says it's welcoming the findings. They're also going to try to ban heading moves by kids who play soccer under the age of 12. Do you think that that is something, based on your sort of medical and professional opinion here, should be something that more youth sports do?
Oh, 100%. You know, Hallie, I moderated a panel a couple of years ago at NYU, and it was hockey, and it was for ice hockey related concussions, and it was all about slamming and this and that, and about, you know, limiting or really changing the rules and regulations of the game in younger athletes. And that is so important, again, Hallie, because these are young kids, and you can imagine these are significant contact sports. And by the time they're graduating from high school, and some of them go on to play, you know, college sports, they're really sustaining, you know, sequential impacts that could have a serious effect on their long-term, you know, mental as well as physical health.
Dr. Natalie Azar, thank you so much. It's good to see you, as always. And that does it for us for this hour. We'll have more for you here tomorrow, same time, same place. Coverage picks up right now.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.